Senator Gallagher. No? Sorry. Right. Let's get... The President has received a message from the House of Representatives forwarding the Narcotic Drugs Amendment Bill 2016 for concurrence. I call the Minister.
I move that this bill may proceed without formalities and be now read a first time.
Is that motion agreed to? All those in favour? Against? I declare that carried. I call the clerk.
A bill for an act to amend the Narcotic Drugs Act 1967 and for related purposes.
Thank you, Minister.
I move that this bill be now read a second time, and I seek leave to have the second reading speech incorporated in Hansard.
Is leave granted? All those in favour? Against? Leave is granted. Senator Gallagher.
Thank you very much. I rise to give the opposition support to the amendment of the Narcotic Drugs Bill. Access to medical cannabis is governed by a complex set of state and Commonwealth laws, regulations and international treaty obligations. The Single Convention on Narcotic Drugs 1961 stipulates that the illicit use of narcotic drugs must be tightly regulated. The rescheduling of cannabis under the Poisons Act is another critical step to making medical cannabis available. This is not dealt with by this bill. This bill is in line with Labor policy, which is to work with states and territory governments to allow the licit access to medical cannabis and also to maintain Commonwealth regulation of medical cannabis and improve the scientific research of the drug. Labor's approach is driven by science and compassion. Australian Labor is committed to the approvals of therapeutic goods based on scientific evidence, and we also recognise the very human need of thousands of Australians for the access to the medicine that they need. Right now, families who are accessing medical cannabis products on the black market are at risk of being arrested and convicted, unable to determine the exact ingredients and the quality of the medicine they are taking, are caught between the risk of criminal sanction and unreliable supply, and knowing that their loved ones will suffer if something doesn't change. And that's why Labor supports access to medical cannabis. Our policy and our national platform clearly state our support for it. The bill before us amends the Narcotic Drugs Act to permit the licensing of growers of medicinal cannabis in Australia and to provide for a fit and proper persons test to be applied to licensees by the Department of Health. There is broad public support for making cannabis products available for medical purposes. There is also broad support for our regulatory system, which ensures Australian medicines are safe. Currently, all therapeutic goods, such as medicines and devices, must be approved by the Therapeutic Goods Administration and listed on the Australian Register of Therapeutic Goods. Once listed on the ARTG, a product may then be considered for listing on the Pharmaceutical Benefits Scheme. In providing a licensing arrangement for medical cannabis products, the TGA regulatory system is left in place. 3 existing pathways are utilised to get medical cannabis to the patients that need it, via authorised prescribers, the Special Access Scheme and through clinical trials. An authorised prescriber can prescribe to their patients an otherwise unapproved medical product. They often have specialist knowledge of the drug or of a specific condition. The authorised prescriber must monitor the outcome of the therapy and report back to the TGA on their prescriptions. The Special Access Scheme is another way in which people will access medical cannabis. Under the SAS, the patient's doctor, their regular GP, needs to apply to the TGA on a case-by-case basis. For these 2 pathways to occur, there really must be clear, nationally consistent clinical guidelines similar to the products produced must meet quality benchmarks and standards. Clinical trials also provide access to unapproved medicines. Trials are already underway in New South Wales, and the data collected by these help researchers to understand. In this bill today, there are 2 types of licences created: an authorisation to cultivate cannabis for manufacture into medical cannabis products, and an authorisation to cultivate cannabis for scientific research into the cannabis plant that is to be used for medical purposes. It is also proper that there be a fit and proper persons test, and that anyone given a licence to produce medical cannabis must fit the strict criteria of this test. There is a strict and wide-ranging test criteria that will be applied to all licensees. Australia has vast experience in managing controlled substances such as poppies. We've also learnt from international experiences. Growers and manufacturers must be able to demonstrate their connection to the supply chain. The end product must be dispensed to the patient and still comply with the Therapeutic Goods Act of 1989. This will have the effect of restricting the number of licensees. Strict security provisions will apply to licensees, ensuring the product is not diverted to illicit uses, and substantial penalties for breaching licence conditions and for unauthorised activities will apply. It's worth noting that the existing criminal code already captures offences such as cultivating cannabis without a licence. I think we all agree in this place that no family should have to choose between getting their loved one the medicine they need and breaking the law. Where currently approved therapeutic goods can't meet the patient's need, Labor is supportive of patients having access to medical cannabis therapies. But it will take some time for the system to come online. Medical cannabis will not be available tomorrow, as there is a lot more work to be done. But Labor is keen to see access to these drugs as soon as practical. Patients who are suffering from a terminal illness or other serious medical condition should be allowed access to safe, reliable and legal medicinal cannabis if prescribed by their doctor. This bill will put in place the supply chain arrangements that will allow the licit production of medical cannabis products, and we believe, if passed by the Senate, will enable the Victorian Government to meet their election commitment to make medical cannabis available in early 2017 for particular patients. Labor would also like to acknowledge the work of advocates who have campaigned for this change. We do acknowledge the government in introducing the legislation, although we note that there has been a substantial delay in getting legislation to this point. Had the bill been introduced last year, there would have been more time for scrutiny and enhancement. I also acknowledge the Victorian Government, which committed legalising access to medicinal cannabis for children with severe epilepsy early last year. In this tight deadline that has really driven the debate, it is this tight deadline that has driven the debate and the speed at which the Parliament addresses this bill. I would also like to acknowledge Labor colleagues in the New South Wales Parliament who pushed for the parliamentary inquiry in the matter, which led to reforms in that state. The New South Wales Government have also vigorously pursued medical trials of cannabis and provided law enforcement by depenalising offences relating to possession and use for particular classes of people. Only the Commonwealth Government can ensure that there is a national scheme which ensures equity of access and a safe and reliable supply. This bill deals with supply by establishing a tightly controlled supply chain with multiple security measures. It also deals with demand by allowing the prescription of these medicines by a doctor through the Special Access Scheme, Authorised Prescriber Scheme and medical trials. This is not about allowing free access to a drug for recreational use. It is about ensuring that there is a legal and regulated market so that family members and carers aren't forced to rely on the black market to relieve the pain of their loved ones. The government have not indicated how it intends to deal with the existing black market supply of illicit medical cannabis products. We acknowledge that the work is currently underway by the TGA to reschedule cannabis so that, subject to the passage of this bill, cannabis-based medicines may become legal in all states and territories via the legal Special Access Scheme and Authorised Prescriber Scheme. Labor seeks leadership from the government to ensure that a patchwork of medical cannabis licit access arrangements do not emerge across the various states and territories. We encourage the government to ensure that this happens in a timely manner. Further, Labor acknowledges that all drugs accessed using the Special Access Scheme and Authorised Prescriber Schemes are not eligible of PBS listing. We are concerned that these drugs will remain expensive and potentially prohibitively expensive for some families. The Australian Government should monitor this, but also provide national leadership to ensure a fair approach to access of this medicine is achieved. I commend the bill to the Senate.
Thank you, Senator Gallagher. Senator McDonald.
Thank you, Madam Acting Deputy President. Well, today is quite a momentous day for those who have been eagerly awaiting the first steps towards legalised cannabinoid treatments for medical conditions in Australia. And I want to start by congratulating the Minister, Ms Lay, and her advisors and the Department for moving as quickly as they have on this particular issue. It first came to my attention, I might say, Madam Acting Deputy President, would you believe, at a convention, a convention of the Liberal National Party of Queensland, not always seen as the most progressive thinking group around the country, but long before it became a public issue, 2 motions were passed at a Liberal National Party state convention in Queensland supporting the use of medicinal cannabis. And I want to say to those people involved in the LNP who first raised this that it really does show that the process works. It's taken some time, but it does work, and it's interesting that ordinary people, through their own political parties, can raise these issues which do, as in this case, lead to legislation starting the process. I also want to give credit where credit is due to Senator Di Natale. Senator Di Natale also shared the view of the importance of medicinal cannabis, and because things weren't moving as quickly as he and others would have hoped, he introduced a private member's bill which was then referred to the Senate Legal and Constitutional Affairs Legislation Committee for inquiry. That committee, which I have the honour of chairing, held a number of public hearings into medicinal cannabis, in which Senator Di Natale and other members of that committee fully and enthusiastically and intelligently participated. And we had an enormous amount of evidence from clinicians, from academics, from ordinary people, from people who came forward and confessed that they were breaking the law. And I might say we sort of, as a committee, as we do as a committee, sort of suggested to those people that they might want to give their evidence in camera. But all of them said, no, we are using thing because it is the only treatment that my family have been able to access that is effective in dealing with certain types of illnesses. Epilepsy was one. And those people were very courageous and came and gave this evidence, and I think their evidence to a degree influenced or had an influence on the committee in recommending that something should be done in a legislative way to allow for medicinal cannabis. Senator Di Natale's bill was one that he, with the help of, I assume, of the library and the clerk's offices, prepared, but of course Senator Di Natale didn't have the resources of the department to look into every aspect, and whilst the committee supported the bill in the broad, the committee was persuaded by the department that there were certain issues in Senator Di Natale's bill which hadn't been looked into, and they related principally to international conventions and international agreements that Australia has with narcotic drugs. So what that bill of Senator Di Natale's did do, and the committee's report did do, was encourage the government to move quickly, and I want to thank again Ms Susan Lay, the Minister, and the Prime Minister at the time, Mr Abbott, both of whom gave the idea of medicinal cannabis a very big tick. And I remember at the joint party room meeting when this was raised, both the then Prime Minister and Ms Lay confirmed to the party room that this was something that had to be done, and it was complicated. I thank the departmental officials and the parliamentary draftsmen on their speed in getting these things done. It's never easy when you're dealing with narcotic drugs to get legislation there and make sure all the T's are crossed and the I's dotted, but it has been done, and it's here in what I might say, in spite of the previous speaker's comments, it's here in record quick time, and all congratulations to the department, the draftsman and the Minister's office for doing that. I also note with a little surprise that the Labor Party and the Greens and the Independents have not required this matter to go back to a committee. If it did, I'm sure any committee hearing would have been very brief because, as I say, the committee had already looked into this in some great length when we were looking at Senator Di Natale's bill. So it's here in the Parliament. It's been passed in the lower house, it will be passed here and come into effect, and I think it's a great example of how Parliament can work effectively and quickly where there are issues involved that need addressing. And as I say, they are issues that, in my case, originated in a state convention of the LNP in Queensland. I want to thank particularly the New South Wales government who appeared before the committee when we were looking at Senator Di Natale's bill and gave very, very good evidence, not only the department but also academics, scientists, clinicians who were working on it, but who explained to us that they had difficulty because even in cases accessing the plant for investigative purposes, for research purposes, at times could have put them in breach of the law. But it's great to see that they've done that. I note the Victorian government has done something as well. The New South Wales government actually made it an election commitment before their last election, as I recall, and allocated some, don't hold me to these figures, but I think it was something like $60 million towards research and getting this implemented. As I say, I'm aware that the Victorian government is also doing something along the same lines. It's important that the Commonwealth, though, legislated, because the narcotics drugs, the single convention on narcotic drugs is something that, of course, only the Commonwealth can really deal with. We do want to make sure too that any legislation involved in relation to the medicinal use of cannabis is Australia-wide, and that you don't get into trouble in different states that you're in with competing and contradictory legislation. I want to make it very clear, Madam Acting Deputy President, that this bill is nothing to do, and certainly diametrically opposed to the recreational use of cannabis. That remains a criminal offence, in my view, so it should. A lot of the mental health problems we see around our country today, I believe, and evidence suggests that much of that is as a result of the early use of cannabis and as a recreational drug. This bill, I emphasise, will not make cannabis available for recreational use or available in any way other than very strict and controlled medicinal use. Madam Acting Deputy President, some will say that the process is convoluted and it's still, whilst the legislation will pass through the Parliament today, and I thank all the other parties for their support for this, but it is the first step. There's a lot to be done from here on in, and it won't be Australian-grown, controlled cannabis for medicinal use won't be available for some time yet, but this is the start. The process is put in place. This bill actually creates a new agency, the Office of Drug Control, and this agency will oversight the program, and it will be very strict about the operational standards. In layman's language, this bill will allow eventually the controlled growing of the cannabis plant under very, very strict conditions. The plant or the process, the manufacture, will then be available for use in very restricted medicinal purposes. As I understand the bill, and it is quite a big bill, not all doctors will be able to prescribe this It will be special clinicians who will have the authority to prescribe this drug in very specifically controlled circumstances. Madam Acting Deputy President, I say again, cannabis is the most used illicit drug in Australia. Australia, unfortunately, has one of the highest per capita rates of illegal cannabis use in the world. According to the National Drug Strategy, I should take that comment by Senator Ludwig and wonder if perhaps he knows too much about this drug. This is a serious thing which, as I say, has cross-party support, and I'm surprised that Senator Ludlam would make light of it in view of the fact that his leader played a very significant part in where we are today. Madam Acting Deputy President, the drug survey said that 35% of the Australian population reported using cannabis at some time in their life, with 10% having used it in the last month, and 3.5% of Australians had used cannabis in the previous week. So it is a problem. Chronic cannabis use can be associated with a number of negative health and social effects, including increased risk of respiratory diseases associated with smoking, including cancer, decreased memory and learning abilities, and decreased motivation in areas such as study, work and concentration. And Madam Acting Deputy President, the Australian Government has made a commitment to work collaboratively with states and territories to not only share knowledge and information on the issues relating to the appropriate use of therapeutic products derived from cannabis, but to also consider health and law enforcement concerns in the context of the Commonwealth Authority and obligations to control the cannabis plant in Australia under the international conventions. Now, Madam Acting Deputy President, I repeat, and I do want to keep saying this, I want to emphasise that this in no way will allow the decriminalisation of the use of this drug, which many scientists say does have long-term health products. Madam Acting Deputy President, I know from my own experience that there are a lot of farmers, forward-looking farmers, who are keen to get involved in the growing of the cannabis plant under controlled conditions. We do that in Australia already with the poppy for use in heroin and for medicinal use, and we have a very strictly controlled regime there. This will be a similar, not the same, but a similar control with the growing of the cannabis plant. As I say, there are forward-looking, sensible farmers who are already seeing an economic livelihood in this and in growing the plant under very, very controlled conditions. The stuff that apparently grows wild, and as I've said jokingly, it's pretty prevalent up in my home area of northern Australia, but those plants, of course, have been genetically modified over the years to have a higher proportion of the bad stuff and a lower proportion of the good stuff in it. The control of the growing will, of course, ensure that the plant is grown under very strict conditions to get the best outcome for medicinal purposes. I mentioned, Madam Acting Deputy President, the single convention on narcotic drugs, which does severely restrict what Australia, or indeed any signatory to that convention, can do. This bill will require amendments to be made to the Therapeutic Goods Act to include regulation making power to provide for a future flexibility, if needed, in relation to authorising medicinal cannabis. The cannabis cultivated in Australia will be able to be used legally and legally manufactured into products to be used to conduct clinical trials and to develop therapeutic products to be used in accordance with the Therapeutic Goods Act. Madam Acting Deputy President, it's not known, and I'm trying to find my note on this, but it came as a surprise to me that presently some doctors can prescribe cannabis in very strict conditions. I don't think a lot of doctors are aware of this, and I actually wrote to the AMA when I found out about this. It's a very convoluted process, but I do mention that those who think that there is a use for medicinal cannabis today should speak to their doctor, who should speak to the department, if necessary, on the very constricted circumstances in which cannabis can already be used. This bill, however, will take the process a lot further. We will grow the plant in Australia, therefore we don't have to rely on imported product that we don't really know where it comes from or how it's grown or what its properties are. And it is an important step forward. The government, in going through this rather lengthy process in double quick time, is conscious that the all-important issue is the safety of patients and the community, and that's why it's essential to have very high safety standards for the medicinal cannabis products and very rigorous clinical controls on the access to them. But it is a step in the right direction. I know from the committee hearing that there will be a number of people in Australia who will be delighted that this bill has reached the Parliament today, and in all expectation will be passed today. As I say, still a way to go, but it is the first step to making this drug available. The evidence given to the committee was quite clear. A lot of people, I might say, didn't know why it worked, but it does actually work in certain illnesses, and those people who have now been illegally using it in Australia will start to be in a process where it can be available. We did have evidence of some people having to fly to the United States twice a year to get their children access to this medicinal cannabinoid, and those sort of people will now have the benefit, or in the months ahead when this is fully implemented, will have the ability to get the required treatment in Australia at a fraction of the cost of what it has cost people in the past to access this drug because of its medicinal properties. So, Madam Acting Deputy President, I'm delighted. I again give credit to Senator Dean Natali in bringing this forward. I again give credit to the Minister and her advisers and the Department for moving as quickly as they have to make sure that this legislation is adopted by the Parliament today, so that this, the wonderful properties of the good use of this drug can be made available to Australians who desperately need it.
Senator Lanehill.
Thank you, Madam Acting Deputy President. I rise to support passage of the Narcotic Drugs Amendment Bill 2016. I do so in the knowledge that I should not let the perfect be the enemy of the good. As most people know, legalising cannabis is Liberal Democrats' policy, and yes, that includes recreational use. This bill is good, but far from perfect. It amends the Narcotic Drugs Act 1967 to establish a national licensing scheme to allow the cultivation of cannabis for medical and scientific purposes. It will allow such cultivation to operate in accordance with Australia's obligations under the 3 UN drug control conventions. Those conventions, the bastard children of US prohibition and the war on drugs, mean that Australia is placed in the position where its new regime for the regulation of medical cannabis is onerous. It involves an elaborate licensing regime. One form of licence authorises the cultivation of cannabis for manufacture into medicinal cannabis products. A second authorises research into the cannabis plant that is to be used for medicinal purposes. It also takes in a strict fit and proper person test. This test will be applied to the applicant farmer or researcher as well as his relevant business associates. It involves consideration of a range of matters, including criminal history, connections, associates and family, financial status, business history, and capacity to comply with licensing requirements. Licence holders will also be expected to remain fit and proper persons too. The regime is explicitly designed to ensure the exclusion of criminal elements who may be tempted, we are told, to use the licence scheme as cover for illegal activities. In short, if you want to grow or research medicinal cannabis under the new legislation, you effectively let the government set up CCTV in your bedroom. I recognise why the bill before us today is comprised almost wholly of red tape. Legalising cannabis for recreational use at the federal level would constitute a denunciation of the UN Drug Control Conventions and almost certainly have a serious impact on Australia's legal opium poppy industry. Our opium poppy growers in Tasmania, who produce about half the world's legal medical opioids, depend on Australia complying with the UN Drug Control Conventions, or they risk their multi-million-dollar international markets. Opium poppy growers already work under a licensing regime that mirrors the one this bill sets up for medicinal cannabis. That said, it is becoming clear that legalising recreational cannabis at the state level in a federal system invites a lot of bleating and chest beating from UN bodies like the International Narcotics Control Board, but not much else. After Colorado legalised recreational cannabis, the INCB thundered that the drug control treaties must be implemented by state parties, including states with federal structures. Last time I looked, cannabis was still legal in Colorado and Oregon, Alaska, Washington and Washington DC, and the sky had not fallen. And yet the INCB's quick summary is drugs are bad. Okay? Australia's fight for legalising recreational cannabis use, it would seem, must largely be prosecuted at the state level. This serves as a reminder that a great deal of international law is nonsense and does not deserve our automatic respect. Legalising recreational cannabis use would deprive organised crime, whether Middle Eastern crime gangs, Asian triads, bikie gangs or relatives of Darth Vader, of a major source of income, and relieve police of the cost of finding and destroying illicit crops. Of the $1.5 billion spent annually on drug law enforcement, 70% is attributable to cannabis. That's an expense we do not need. Then there's the opportunity for increased tax revenue, something of interest to the big spenders on both sides of this chamber. If its consumption is legal, it can be taxed. I recently asked the Parliamentary Budget Office how much money the government could raise if it legalised and then applied the GST to cannabis. The answer, $300 million, and that's just in GST revenue. I didn't ask them about other forms of revenue raising because I find high taxes obnoxious. Finally, it is not legitimate use of government power to prohibit adults from doing something that does not harm others. It is irrelevant that it may not be wise to use a plant for recreational purposes. I neither endorse nor recommend recreational use. The point is simply that governments do not have the moral authority to ban something based either on disapproval or a desire to protect people from their own choices. It is also a basic reality that most people have tried it at some point. That includes President Obama and me. When the law says one thing and people do another, a free society changes the law. Madam Acting Deputy President, medical cannabis is only half the answer. This bill is a step in the right direction, but only a step. It is high time we stop using international law to justify interfering in adult choices. Government opinions are only relevant to those who are incapable of deciding things for themselves.
Senator Brown.
Madam Acting Deputy President, I rise to speak on the Narcotics Amendment Bill 2016, and I'd like to put on record my appreciation of Stephen Jones, the member for Frosby, for his work in this area and the work that he's done in promoting the need for this important reform. Now, this bill, as other contributors have said in the debate today, is an important part of the regulatory and legislative framework that will allow Australians to access medicinal cannabis products that are available. The simple fact is that we know these products work. We know that across this country there are people who are already accessing medicinal cannabis products, and these people are telling us that these products have completely changed their lives. These are people suffering from pain or dealing with medical conditions who have sought relief from other medications that haven't worked for them. However, to access these products, life-saving and life-changing products, these people have to get it from the black market. In doing so, they are at risk of being arrested and convicted. They are also unable to determine the exact ingredients and the quality of the medicines they are taking. People are caught up between the risk of criminal sanction, an unreliable supply, and knowing their loved ones will suffer if something doesn't change. For this reason, I welcome this bill as a definite step in the right direction. No one, no family, no parent should be faced with making a decision about getting a loved one the treatment they need and breaking the law. But as I've said, currently this is the decision many people have to make. This is because people cannot find relief from pain with the existing therapeutic goods and have debilitating and life-threatening conditions which cause unbearable pain and muscle spasticity. Under the current law, people are expected to see their child, partner or parent in immense pain, knowing relief is available but illegal. The establishment of a medicinal cannabis licensing scheme will help patients who are suffering from a terminal illness or other serious medical conditions access to safe, reliable and legal medicinal cannabis if prescribed by their doctor. The bill before us today will put in place the supply chain arrangements that will allow the production of the legal production of medical cannabis products. It is, as has been said in the debate today, the first critical step that will allow medicinal cannabis to be produced in this country. Primarily, it amends the Narcotic Drugs Act to permit the licensing of growers of medicinal cannabis in Australia. It also provides a fit and proper person test to be applied to licensees by the Department of Health. If the bill is adopted today, it will ensure that Australia remains compliant with its obligations under the Single Convention. We know that there is broad public support for making cannabis products available for medicinal purposes. Survey after survey, poll after poll has proved this point. But there is also broad public support for having a regulatory system which ensures that Australian medicines are safe. Labor is committed to working with the government and interested parties to ensure that the Commonwealth Government can provide national leadership to ensure that medicinal cannabis treatments are made available in a safe and legal way. Madam Acting Deputy President, I want to, in my contribution here today, to pay tribute to two people in my home state of Tasmania who have worked tirelessly to see the use of medicinal cannabis legalised. Marilyn and Andrew Irving have led the campaign on this matter and has been nothing but short of inspirational. Marilyn has a painful degenerative nerve condition, and when I saw her in the week before Christmas, I was pleased that although in a wheelchair, she was in better health than I had seen her for a long time. Andrew, Marilyn's husband, was at his wit's end trying to ease Marilyn's constant pain and terrible tremors from her condition. He was desperate, and so he turned to medicinal cannabis. He was blown away. These are his own words. He was blown away with what he calls the near miraculous effects of the cannabis oil on Marilyn. Andrew pays $280 a month for cannabis drops, but doesn't begrudge the money because it has helped Marilyn and helped to transform their lives. As I've said, Andrew has become a real vocal campaigner on the need for this bill. In the words of Duncan Avey, a journalist with the Mercury newspaper, and in his article in the Mercury on December 20 last year, Andrew has taken his campaign to the world by producing a digital newsletter called The Leaf, espousing the benefits of medicinal cannabis. Andrew says the aim of the newsletter is to increase education on the issue and to help reduce the stigma users encounter. All users want to be able to use medicinal cannabis within the law. Andrew has at times been left emotionally drained since he has become an advocate for medicinal cannabis. He's had many calls and inquiries from people who are desperate. As Andrew says, and I quote, "It has been heartbreaking to hear people crying on the other end of the line. People are still suffering, people are still dying, people are still in pain," end quote. As I've said, this bill is an important first step to ensuring people like Andrew and Marilyn Irving are able to access safe and legally approved medicinal cannabis. I would like to now turn to the work done by Tasmania's Shadow Attorney General Lara Giddings, who this month has announced that the Tasmanian Labor government will immediately decriminalise cannabis possession and use for Tasmanians suffering from a range of severe medical conditions. The Tasmanian legislation would decriminalise the possession and use of cannabis for medical purposes for people that suffer epilepsy, multiple sclerosis, cancer or HIV/AIDS treatment and severe chronic pain. It would have to be approved by 2 medical specialists, and other medical conditions would be considered by an independent medical advisory committee. A Tasmanian Labor government's legislation would also call for the licensed cultivation, manufacture and dispensing of medicinal cannabis in Tasmania. A Tasmanian Labor government would also launch complementary clinical trials of medical cannabis to those of Victoria and New South Wales in conjunction with Tasmanian businesses in collaboration with the University of Tasmania. And as Ms Giddings said, and I quote, "The decriminalisation of cannabis is so important to so many Tasmanian families who are faced with the awful choice at the moment of having to either watch their loved ones suffer or break the law by providing them with cannabis," end quote. Madam Acting Deputy President, this bill is important in ending the delays for people who continue to suffer needlessly. This bill has at its core the easing the suffering for those of whom medicinal cannabis can ease their pain and provide relief, and I commend the bill to the Senate.
Senator, no? Senator Xenophon, then.
Thank you very much, Madam Acting Deputy President. Today I join many of my colleagues in this place to express my support for this bill. Earlier today I was at the first National Family Drug Support Day and just want to pay tribute to the terrific work that Tony Trimmingham, the founder and CEO of Family Drug Support, has done. And it's something that has multi-party support. Tony Trimmingham tragically a number of years ago lost his son to a drug overdose. And I think it's fair to say that it's an expression of the love for his son, that he has continued to campaign for support for family members who have been affected by substance abuse. And congratulations to Tony Trimmingham and his team for what they have put on about reducing the shame, the stigma and discrimination for families, of promoting support services for families and friends affected by drug use, and promoting harm reduction measures to reduce the harm, to reduce the deaths. And I think it's very important in the context of this bill. This bill is not about the liberalisation of drug policy in Australia. This bill is about implementing a framework so that Australia can meet its obligations under the Single Convention on Narcotic Drugs of 1961 when we embark on the process of cultivating cannabis for medicinal and scientific purposes. In no way do I condone so-called recreational drug use, taking illicit drugs, and in fact some legal drugs can be a very risky business. There is no such thing as the safe use of many of these drugs, whether it's heroin, crystal, methamphetamine or cannabis. The National Institute on Drug Abuse in the United States has published a number of medical studies relating to the impacts of marijuana use. These studies have shown that marijuana use during development can cause long-term or possibly permanent adverse changes in the brain. Similarly, the Australian Medical Association warns that regular and prolonged cannabis use can lead to anxiety, insomnia, appetite disturbance and depression. Adolescents are particularly vulnerable to harm. In fact, medical imaging studies in adolescents show that regular marijuana users display impaired neural connectivity in specific brain regions. These brain regions are involved in a broad range of important functions like memory, learning and impulse control. Furthermore, the research paper Gone to Pot, a review of the association between cannabis and psychosis, published in 2014, showed that there is strong evidence supporting a link between marijuana use and psychotic disorders in those with a pre-existing genetic condition. So let us emphasise that the cannabis that will be cultivated in Australia following the passage of this bill will be all about its medicinal properties, people with medical conditions where they can be assisted by it. And the science in relation to the use of cannabis to treat debilitating illnesses is rapidly growing. Victoria, New South Wales and Queensland have already joined forces to take part in medicinal cannabis trials. I hope that South Australia will not be far behind with implementing its own trials, particularly in light of a survey conducted late last year which showed 90% of South Australians believe cannabis should be made available for medicinal purposes. Without this bill, state governments will be forced to import cannabis rather than cultivate their own stocks. It is well known that medicinal cannabis has been shown to treat a number of debilitating illnesses and conditions, including severe seizures from epilepsy. Right now, parents of children with epilepsy that is unresponsive to conventional treatment face a heartbreaking choice. They either attempt to obtain medicinal cannabis from the black market and risk being prosecuted, or they persist with drugs which can have devastating side effects on their children. I've met with families in Adelaide who live in fear that their child's next seizure will be their last. Tragically, one of these families did lose their beautiful daughter to epilepsy in February of 2012. In the months leading up to the fatal seizure, the family had been waiting and waiting to see a specialist in one of Adelaide's hospitals to talk about their concerns for their daughter. Despite being considered an urgent case, the family was told it could be more than a year before they could get in to see the doctor they needed. In a country like Australia, those sorts of waiting times should be unacceptable. So the more progress we make in medicinal cannabis, the better. And I also want to make reference to Mark Elliott, who I know because of work that I've done of parents with children with epilepsy in South Australia. A very decent man, a loving father, and Mark has spoken out in the media in Adelaide about his daughter Charlotte, who would now be 10 years old. And the article in the Advertiser by Alyssa Black and Tessa Ackerman made the point that imagine for a moment watching your child suffer through dozens of seizures a week, through the pain, the indignity, the fear. Then imagine hearing of a treatment sanctioned overseas that has worked wonders for children with epilepsy as serious as your little girls, so serious that conventional treatments and drugs offer little help. It has brought them back to life. Then imagine being told that if you use it, you'll go to jail. This is Mark Elliott's reality, and it goes on to talk about his absolute dilemma in relation to this. Clearly, the medical evidence is in that his daughter can get assistance that other medication cannot provide through medical cannabis, and that's why this is important for families such as Mark Elliott and his daughter Chloe. By allowing cannabis to be cultivated in Australia for medicinal and research purposes, we are one step closer to bringing these families the relief they so desperately need. I would like to briefly acknowledge the important safeguards that have been built into this bill, and especially around the licensing and permitting framework. A strong, fit and proper person test will be applied to all licence applicants and relevant business associates. This test will look into factors like criminal history, business history and also the capacity to comply with the licence requirements. These safeguards are necessary to ensure that those involved in organised crime do not try to hide their criminal activities through participation in this program. Other safeguards include controls on the quantities and strains of cannabis that can be cultivated under this program. Where cultivation is for the purpose of medicinal cannabis to supply to patients, the amount of cannabis that can be grown will be determined beforehand. This will ensure that supply meets but does not exceed patient requirements. Taken together, the measures in the Narcotic Drugs Amendment Bill 2016 are an important first step in the advancement of Australia's medical treatment and research capabilities. I reiterate once again my support for this bill.
Senator Urquhart.
Much, Madam Acting Deputy President. I rise today to speak on the Narcotic Drugs Amendment Bill 2016. This bill amends the Narcotic Drugs Act to allow the licensing of growers of medicinal cannabis in Australia to establish a tightly controlled supply chain. I commend this move and recognise that in my home state of Tasmania we have already been safely and effectively growing poppies to produce opiates for many years, and I believe there is much to learn from this experience. I'd also like to recognise the government's agreement to create an expert advisory panel, which I hope will go some way to addressing the process questions that Labor has had with this bill. Labor is willing to work constructively with both the government and Greens in the formation of this panel. However, I'm still disappointed that this bill took so long to get to the Parliament and that it won't be sent to a Senate inquiry for consideration. A short inquiry was Labor's preferred option. This wasn't to hold things up, but to ensure there weren't unintended consequences that could limit the effectiveness of the bill or lead to other unexpected issues. This is a complex legal area with many impacting state and federal laws as well as international treaties. In this context, it's a shame that the government and the Greens have joined to reject a Senate inquiry, which would have created an avenue for public input and expert advice that could quite possibly have resulted in better legislation at the end of the day. That being said, I'd like to congratulate those of all stripes who have seen that medicinal cannabis is a health issue that should be elevated above partisan politics. Access to safe, reliable, legal and affordable medicinal cannabis is something that I've personally been fighting for a long time. Last year, I was very pleased that I was able to be part of the process of change as co-sponsor of the regulator of the medicinal cannabis bill, which would have established a government body to manage the production and supply of this vital treatment. There is no doubt that cannabis has brought relief and dramatic reduction in pain and suffering to so many Australians. In my home state of Tasmania, I have personally met with many individuals who have seen their lives and the lives of their loved ones turned around through this treatment. Sadly, though, there are just as many heartbreaking stories of those who continue to suffer because they are unable to gain access. And there are many others who are still branded criminals under Australian law for accessing and using this treatment despite the incredible and proven health outcomes. For too long, Australians have been forced to navigate underground criminal networks in order to secure a medication that we know works. There is no doubt in my mind that change is desperately overdue. And today I'd like to recognise all the individuals who have been fighting through every possible avenue to make this change happen. When medicinal cannabis is finally legalised, Parliament may be the instrument, but it certainly wouldn't have happened without the tireless advocacy of so many people, and they are very special people. I'd specifically like to formally acknowledge all the brave Tasmanians who have had the courage to go public with their own stories despite potential personal risks in order to mount the case for reform. People like Natalie Daly from Ulverston, who has publicly shared her very personal experience of the incredible change medicinal cannabis has made to her life since she was diagnosed with a rare form of cancer. And Lynn Cleaver from Launceston. Lynn has fought tirelessly for change for her son Jeremy, who suffers from severe epileptic seizures which have been dramatically reduced through the use of cannabis. And Nicole Cowes from Kingston, who has been a fantastic advocate for change since cannabis turned her young daughter Alice's life around. And I can't forget Jessie from my home region of the northwest coast of Tasmania and her amazing little girl April, who is 4 and started school for the first time this year. April suffers from Dravet syndrome, which causes her more than 1,000 seizures a day. At their wits' end, Jessie and her partner Paul turned to cannabis oil in an attempt to contain April's attacks. It wouldn't be an overstatement to describe April's turnaround as miraculous, with her attacks dropped from triple digits to as few as 6. And I would like to read a post that Jessie posted on her Facebook page just a week ago. And she writes about April. And she says, "This girl has rocked my world. The love I feel for her is nothing I have ever experienced before. The journey I signed up to since her birth was not one I ever asked for, but was given. I am so proud that it was me chosen to be her mother. It was me that was to take part in such a horrific, scary, yet wonderful journey. There have been so many close calls. So many times we were told her little life was coming to an end. We planned a funeral as we were told it was best for her family. We even had someone close record a written song for this. Just over a year ago, her tiny heart stopped beating and it took 20 minutes of non-stop help by paramedics to get her back. Most would have stopped by that time. But the man that brought her back on this horrific day never, and she's emphasised never, stopped. And if not for him, I wouldn't have my April. All I remember was telling her over and over, "You don't give up, princess, you come back to me." I remember standing there watching him and screaming, "Save her." The worst part was having my eldest daughter stand next to me screaming, "Mummy, what's wrong with April?" over and over. I could not comfort her. I couldn't speak to her. I was in a state and was praying to God to save my daughter. April went 20 minutes with not breathing. She suffered horrific brain damage and lost many skills, but regained some over time. Thank God we have never had a similar experience since that day. I know Dravet is a very bad disease. I know it claims the lives of so many little kids every day. I used to live my life thinking I would lose April. I never planned anything with her because we were told each day was a blessing. Not so long ago, I chose not to live like that. I chose to believe that my daughter would not die and that she would actually live a long life. I started to think different for her, for me and my family. There was no point in me falling to bits, as despite April's illness, I had 3 other tiny faces who needed me to be there, Mummy, and needed me to be positive. I don't know what April's future holds, but none of us know what the future holds. So I just feel blessed she can go to school, that she was happy, and I pray for her. I know every mother says this, but I truly believe April is here to change the world. I need to believe she will go on to adult life and be fine. No way, if I can help it, will she leave this world before I do. So there are many others across the state, and indeed across the country, who have bravely and compellingly made the case for change. To all of those people, by putting a human face on this issue, you have helped to put medicinal cannabis firmly on the political agenda, and for this you should be congratulated. You have made great steps in convincing 3/4 of Australians that medicinal cannabis needs to be legalised. Now it's time for the law to catch up. The bill before us today probably wouldn't have been the bill that Labor would have introduced, but we can't let the perfect be the enemy of the good, and we won't stand in the way of this legislation because we do believe it is moving in the right direction. There is no doubt that the intent of this bill aligns with Labor's party policy. Last year, Leader of the Opposition, Bill Shorten, announced that a Labor government would commit to making medicinal cannabis available to those who need it. There have also been some very progressive and positive moves in some states in this area. The Queensland Premier, Anastasia Palaszczuk, has thrown her support behind trials and law reform. Victorian Premier Daniel Andrews went to the election promising to make medicinal cannabis available by 2017. New South Wales has held an inquiry and also committed to undertake trials. The 2013 inquiry in this state made a recommendation for a uniform national scheme, and this is what Labor would like to see also. In fact, federal Labor has already committed to developing a nationally consistent scheme where access to medicinal cannabis isn't determined by your postcode, and the vagaries of the laws in your state. Currently, we have a system that criminalises those that take their health into their own hands. We have a system which sends otherwise law-abiding Australians to the black market to source what can be a life-saving treatment. Medicinal cannabis users are exposed to prosecution and further legal action that can have serious implications for their family and working lives. And because the only source of the product is through criminal networks, both supply and quality can be very unreliable. This undoubtedly leads to further health risks for people who rely so much on this treatment. We also have doctors who privately recommend the treatment to their patients but aren't allowed to put their recommendations on the official record formally for fear of the professional ramifications for themselves. As a result, medicinal cannabis cannot be taken into account as part of a holistic treatment regime. This isn't right. While I'd like to acknowledge the moves by some states for change in this area, it's clear that a federal framework is absolutely necessary, and it is clear that people should not be criminalised for taking responsible steps to look after their health or the health of their loved ones. This is something that I'm particularly concerned about and something that I would like to see further detail on how this will work under the bill before us here today. We need to ensure that there are adequate safeguards within the legislation to ensure that people who use cannabis for legitimate medical concerns are not at risk of prosecution. While I understand it is proposed that patients will be able to access treatment on prescription, I would like to see a lot more detail on how this is going to work in practice. I understand that when the legislation passes, the TGA will move to make the product available through clinical trials, the Special Access Scheme and Authorised Prescriber Scheme. However, I would still like a guarantee from the government that Australians with legitimate health concerns will be able to access treatment within the law, regardless of where they live. In the meantime, those who are using cannabis for medicinal purposes should be free from prosecution. National leadership and nationally consistent laws are absolutely vital so we don't end up with a patchwork landscape where you can be a criminal in one state but a legal user in the next one. Another area that I think needs to be a key focus is affordability. Many users of medicinal cannabis are very unwell and often are only able to work a limited number of hours if they are able to work at all. And as a result, money can be incredibly tight. But this shouldn't be an impediment to securing the treatment that they so dearly need for them or their loved ones. And I would call on the government to ensure that affordability is a key goal of the implementation of this legislation. In summary, while there are some details about how this bill will work in practice that I am cautious about, I recognise that it is a move in the right direction and we are happy to support it in this place today. We need to guarantee that safe, reliable, affordable and legal medicinal cannabis is available affordably to those Australians who would benefit from its treatment. I urge the government to ensure that all of these key requirements are met as the bill proceeds into implementation, and I commend all those who fought so hard to get action in this important health policy area.
Senator Di Natale.
Thank you, Mr Deputy President. I rise today to speak in support of the Narcotic Drugs Amendment Bill of 2016. Dan Haslam was 20 years old when he was diagnosed with stage 4 bowel cancer. Just think about that, a 20-year-old boy diagnosed with bowel cancer, the prime of his life, a world of possibilities ahead of him, with a terminal diagnosis. And Dan went through hell. He spent years enduring chemotherapy treatment that made him nauseous, he lost weight, he was unable to eat. It impacted every aspect of his life. Dan developed something called anticipatory nausea. Now, nausea in and of itself is an awful symptom. It's debilitating. Those people who experience chemotherapy say that of all of their symptoms, often it's the nausea that's the worst. Anticipatory nausea is just the thought of going in to having chemotherapy triggers nausea. So without the drug itself, just simply the notion that you're going to sit down, have a toxic drug injected into your arm will trigger nausea. And he was so unwell, he lost so much weight, that it appeared that the chemotherapy would no longer be used. Then, quite by accident, Dan's family heard about medicinal cannabis. It's interesting, Dan's father's a law enforcement officer, his mother Lucy heard about it, and of course, like any desperate parent, they did what they could. They thought this was a last resort. They tried medicinal cannabis. Initially, Dan smoked it, and the effects were profound. Dan had an immediate response. His nausea settled. He had more of an appetite, and it helped to give him some quality of life in those final few years. Today marks 1 year since Dan's passing. It's a year today since Dan left us, and so it is incredibly fitting that we're here today marking the passage of this bill, standing in support of legislation that Dan and his family helped to drive forward. I know that Lucy Haslam wanted to be here today. Lucy, this wouldn't have happened without your contribution. Unfortunately, things move quickly sometimes in this place. Far too often they move slowly, but on this issue we're debating a piece of legislation that we thought might be in this parliament next week. I'm sorry you can't be here today. I know you wanted to be here, and I know you'll be watching from Tamworth. To you, I want to say on behalf of the Australian Greens, on behalf of all of the people in this parliament, thank you for everything that you have done, and I want to let you know that your family's grief, your family's pain and suffering has not been in vain, and this is a legacy that Dan will leave here in this parliament. It's all too sad that there are many people right across the country who have to endure the same sort of pain and suffering that Dan and his family have had to endure, or to be treated like criminals if they resort to what is now regarded as an effective medicine and effective treatment for something like nausea, and indeed many other conditions, which I'll come to in a moment. It was on the back of the Haslam family and their wonderful advocacy. I'm always amazed by an individual who could be confronted with such grief and pain and suffering, and to turn that around and to use that to make a positive contribution, to have the strength and the courage and the vision to be able to harness that grief in a way that makes an enormous positive contribution on something like this. It always amazes me. I don't think I'd have the strength in those circumstances. On the back of Lucy's family and the stories of families just like the Haslams, the Greens decided that we would introduce legislation here into the federal parliament. Legislation based on ensuring that we had the production, the manufacture, the supply, the use, the research, importation of medicinal cannabis. And it's that legislation that is the genesis of this bill. But we recognise that this couldn't be seen as a partisan issue. And what we're seeing here today is this parliament at its best, when far too often we see this parliament at its worst. I want to acknowledge Melissa Park and Sharman Stone, who are the co-conveners of the Parliamentary Group for Drug Policy and Law Reform. Melissa Park, a Labor member, Sharman Stone, a Liberal member, and together we decided that this would be a priority for our group. We also acknowledged that we needed to introduce the legislation into one of the Houses of Parliament. We decided on the Senate, and we sought co-sponsors for that legislation. I want to acknowledge Senator Urquhart for her contribution and her moving words just now. Senator Lanehelm and Senator McDonald. Now, Senator McDonald and I see we are on opposite poles of the political spectrum. But there are moments in this place when you put aside your partisan differences and recognise that it is important to work in the common good, in the national interest, to try and get something done. And I want to acknowledge Senator McDonald and his involvement with the inquiry that looked into this piece of legislation. Through that inquiry, the inquiry into the Regulator of Medicinal Cannabis Bill, which we had hearings in Brisbane, in Canberra, in Melbourne, and we heard from a range of people. We heard from experts, from academics, from doctors, scientists, from patient groups, but most importantly we heard from patients themselves. We heard evidence about the effectiveness of medicinal cannabis. We had Emeritus Professor Lawrence Mather, who said quite clearly, "The evidence inarguably demonstrates cannabis to be a useful medication and ought to be available to patients in need." We heard from Dr Alex Wodak, that the evidence was very clear that this was a useful medication. There are many claims made about the effectiveness of medicinal cannabis, and to be frank, some of them are still unproven, and I suspect some of them won't hold up to the scrutiny of evidence. It is not a cure-all for everything. However, it is a very effective treatment for a range of conditions, and there is no reason why it should not be treated as a medicine just like any other. We know that it's effective for chemotherapy-induced nausea. You heard Dan's story. We know that it's effective for muscle spasms that are a consequence of multiple sclerosis. In fact, there's a medication approved for that use. We know that there's evidence for effectiveness for particular types of epilepsy, particularly amongst young children. Miraculous stories about the benefit associated with the use of that drug for those young kids, many of whom aren't developing appropriately and are having seizure after seizure after seizure, causing incredible heartache within families right around the country. We know for many conditions there is good evidence, and there is no reason why this drug should not be treated like any other medicine. People are naturally concerned. They've heard stories about the impact of psychosis associated with the use of cannabis. We heard from Professor McGregor about some of the issues associated with that. Much of the psychosis associated with the recreational use of cannabis is likely to be attributed to the fact that, due to the fact that this is an illegal drug and we're seeing very highly potent forms with high THC and low CBD, we're seeing potential associations with psychosis amongst its for recreational use. But where we can have the controlled production for medicinal purposes, where we have a higher ratio of what's called CBD, we know that that may be protective against psychosis. Interestingly, we heard from the inquiry that CBD, a component of cannabis, is now being researched to look at as a treatment for psychosis. So we heard about the effectiveness of the drug. We heard about its potency in terms of responding to things like nausea and muscle spasm. But nothing can replace the words of patients and their experience with using that drug. We heard about the heartbreaking story of a young mother who saw their child having seizure after seizure, not responding to a cocktail of pharmaceutical anticonvulsants, and yet getting miraculous relief from medicinal cannabis. She spoke out about that publicly. And what was she confronted with? A knock on the door, the police, and an interview with the Department of Human Services assessing her fitness to be a mother. Think about that. A mother providing her child with medication, who is being now interrogated about whether she is fit to be a mother because she's providing her child with what is an illegal substance. And that's why this bill is so critical, because it gets us on the path to treating this effective medicine as a medicine. But we also need to recognise that this bill has serious limitations. It is an important piece of the puzzle, but it's not the missing piece of the puzzle as it's been described. It is an important first step, but there is a long way to go before this medicine finds its way into the hands of patients. And that is ultimately the test of whether any legislation is successful. Do I, as someone who suffers from a condition like chemotherapy-induced nausea, like multiple sclerosis and muscle spasms that come from that, can I go to my doctor and be prescribed this medicine? That's ultimately the test. This legislation won't get us there on its own. It's an important reform, but there's much more work to be done. We are relieved. It's taken a long time, almost 2 years, but we are relieved that the government has decided that it's time for a national approach. So we do welcome the passage of this legislation. But what needs to be done now? Well, cannabis in all its forms, medicinal or otherwise, remains an illegal drug. So I'll say that again. Medicinal cannabis, as the law now stands, is an illegal drug. The technicalities of that is that it's scheduled as a Schedule 9 drugs, alongside other drugs like cocaine and heroin and other illicit substances. That's where medicinal cannabis is classified in the classification scheme of all drugs. So we need to change that. And I understand that the TGA is currently going through a review process to look at the rescheduling of cannabis for medicinal purposes. That is a good thing. Long overdue. When we first interrogated the TGA about that possibility, we were told that was unlikely to happen. But I understand that there is now a review process, hopefully with the outcome of changing the scheduling around medicinal cannabis so that it is no longer an illegal substance. We do need to ensure that the TGA does its work, but there are also a whole range of questions around the supply chain. So while this legislation creates the framework to grow and manufacture the drug, there is nothing to outline what happens in terms of the supply chain of that drug. Where does it go? How does it get there? What's the role of community pharmacy? Will this drug be dispensed through community pharmacy? We don't know. Will it be hospital pharmacy? We're not sure. Or will there be some other process? So that work still needs to be done. Once this drug is made available through, we hope, community pharmacy, then how is it made available to patients? Will it be prescribed as per any other drug with a normal script? At the moment, it appears that there will be a special access program for particular patients and that doctors need to achieve some sort of authorised prescriber status, quite possibly. We're not sure. So that detail needs to be worked through. At the moment, this legislation allows us to grow and manufacture the drug, but it is silent on the role of community pharmacy and of the medical profession in terms of the prescription of that drug. I understand that work is being done there. We don't know how much it will cost. As Senator Urquhart said previously, cost cannot be a barrier to access for this drug. We don't know what strains will be approved for use and so on. Much more work needing to be done. So we approached the government again in the spirit of making sure that this was not a partisan issue, and we said that we felt that if we are to make progress on this, that what we need to see is we need to see the establishment of an independent advisory body. An independent advisory body providing some advice and input to the relevant departments who are proceeding through the next steps. And to their credit, the government and the Health Minister have agreed to the establishment of that independent advisory body. I think that's important. It allows those people who work in this space to ensure that progress is being made. The advisory body will compose of an independent chair, members of the states and territories. Of course, they have a big role here, and the role of some state governments, the Victorian state government, the New South Wales state government, the Queensland state government, have all been very important in helping to put pressure on so that we get a national framework, because it's critically needed. We're going to see scientists with expertise in cannabis pharmacology and toxicology on that advisory body. We'll see community pharmacy. We'll also see people with expertise in prescribing, pain management, end-of-life care, people with experience in the horticulture aspects, and of course law enforcement. And most importantly, patient representatives. So that is an important step, and we acknowledge that the government has supported that initiative, and we want to thank the government for ensuring that that happens. So this is progress. It's significant progress, but there is much more that needs to be done. Let me just say that I am very proud to be part of a party that has had the courage now for many years to stand up and advocate for this reform, long before it became flavour of the month, long before it was an issue that dominated state and federal parliament. And I want to pay special tribute to one of our state MPs, John Kay, who's unwell at the moment. I hope you're getting better soon, John. But he was instrumental in the referral to the Upper House New South Wales inquiry to ensure that this was debated in the New South Wales Upper House, which gave impetus to many of the reforms that we're seeing in the New South Wales Parliament. And of course, I want to finish by congratulating the tireless work of the Haslam family. Your advocacy on this issue has been inspirational. The nation owes you a great debt. The many people right across the country who one day will benefit from this medication in the same ways they benefit from many other medications that are provided to them. So they're not made to feel like criminals. They will owe you a great debt. So Lucy, back in Tamworth, the Haslam family, thank you again. Your contribution here will be remembered always. Ultimately, we won't rest until this final test is met. Will someone be able to go to the doctor with a condition for which we know medicinal cannabis provides significant relief, and will their doctor be able to prescribe it in a timely way so that they get that relief? That will be the conclusion of a debate that has started today, and we welcome that day along with many other Australians.
Senator Singh.
I rise to speak on the Narcotics Drug Amendment Bill 2016 and gladly in support of this bill, as Labor is supporting this bill that makes a medicinal cannabis licensing scheme legal in Australia. A number of Labor members and senators and other senators in this place have been pushing for changes to this law for some time. The Commonwealth Parliament, through this bill, is playing very much its part in helping to ensure that families will no longer have to access medicinal cannabis products illegally or on the black market, and to ensure we have a regulated licensing scheme in Australia. Now, why? Because I've learnt, and so many of us have learnt, from families, from sufferers, from people in pain, of their personal stories, their stories of pain and of relief. Relief from this medicine, medicinal cannabis providing that relief. So why are we doing this bill? Because families should no longer have to find themselves caught between the risk of criminal action on one hand and using an unreliable supply on the other, all the while knowing that their loved ones will suffer if something does not change. So I rise today in the hope that in the coming months, states and territories in Australia will work together to ensure that medicinal cannabis is legal, is safe and available to those in need. Because in passing this bill, we are doing our part at the federal level, but we also need the states to do theirs to make medicinal cannabis available to those families who need it most. This bill, of course, is, though, a very first critical step that we will enable medicinal cannabis to be produced in this country. Primarily, it amends the Narcotics Drug Act to permit the licensing of growers of medicinal cannabis in Australia, provides fit and proper person tests to be applied to licences by the Department of Health. We know there is broad public support for making cannabis products available for medicinal purposes in Australia. There's been survey after survey, poll after poll that has proved that. But there's also been broad public support for having a regulatory system which ensures that Australian medicines are safe. And I do note the AMA had previously called for a coordinated approach to medicinal cannabis and raised their concerns about previous bills. But the experience of watching a loved one suffer is soul-destroying. We feel their pain, their exhaustion, and the fact that they are often powerless to help. After listening to the overwhelming evidence during the Senate inquiry that I participated in last year with Senator Di Natale, Senator Ian McDonald, Senator Urquhart, after hearing all of that evidence, overwhelming evidence and personal stories from families, it was clear that legislation was needed, and so our laws do need to change. Our current law does not reflect the reality that medicinal cannabis is already being used successfully as a form of pain relief and a means to control diseases such as epilepsy. Nor is medicinal cannabis a new or controversial treatment. Indeed, until the 1970s even, it was available in Australia. And evidence suggests that medicinal properties were well recognised in ancient China, where physicians recommended it for the relief of constipation, gout, malaria, loss of appetite, as well as in aid to childbirth. Cannabis was widely used for a variety of ailments such as muscle spasms, menstrual cramps, rheumatism, convulsions, rabies, epilepsy. It was also used to promote uterine contractions in childbirth and as a sedative to induce sleep. So it has a long history and should not be controversial. As well, we can look internationally at other jurisdictions that have recognised the benefits of medicinal cannabis. Israel has a medicinal cannabis scheme under which medicinal cannabis is supplied to patients who are approved by the Israeli Ministry of Health through licensed growers in Israel who cultivate cannabis plants on a not-for-profit basis. Health Canada has granted access to cannabis for medicinal purposes to Canadians who have had their support of their physicians. And again, in the Netherlands, the government has licensed growers to produce standardised cannabis which would be prescribed to doctors and dispensed by pharmacists. So, of course, we can learn from other countries in how they've administered medicinal cannabis. But as I said, this community support is so significant in Australia for the medicinal use of cannabis that this has to happen sooner than later. The 2013 National Drug Strategy Household Survey by the Australian Institute of Health and Welfare found that around 70% of respondents supported a change in legislation permitting the use of cannabis for medicinal purposes. And 74% of respondents were in favour of clinical trials into medicinal cannabis. Over the last 18 months, I've been incredibly touched by the stories of patients using medicinal cannabis and also to learn of their families who support those suffering. They are the human faces of devastating diseases and for a variety of reasons have found conventional medicines have not worked for them. Daniel Haslam is one of those individuals. Dan was a courageous young man who advocated fearlessly for the use of medicinal cannabis right up until his death. He was diagnosed with terminal cancer at just 20 years of age. He dedicated himself to promoting a cause he believed could bring some relief to people suffering from painful, life-threatening diseases such as he was. In doing so, he advocated that conventions have not kept pace with scientific progress. And Lucy Haslam, Dan's mum, presented compelling evidence to the Senate inquiry into medicinal cannabis last year. She said, and I quote, "I've spoken to cancer patients and I've spoken to people with MS who were ready to commit suicide but are now looking to go back to work." Lucy Haslam, your tireless work has helped us get to this point today. We owe you a great debt and gratitude for all of your advocacy, for your family, for Dan, for everyone in the community, and you have touched the lives of so many, including so many of us here, that has helped us get to this point. And in my own home state, in Tasmania, Nicole Cowles has also been an inspiring advocate on behalf of her daughter Alice, who suffers from extreme seizures. Nicole has testified to the significant improvement in Alice's condition after beginning treatment with medicinal cannabis. Her story joins many I have heard in Tasmania, grandmas with severe back pain who no longer need conventional painkillers, mothers with substantial shakes who have been able to reinvigorate their lives, pain, seizures, shakes, cancer patients, depression. I've sat with these people as they've told me their stories, their remarkable stories, some brought back from the edge, who have then been able to live again because of the benefits of medicinal cannabis. And in listening to their stories, it reminded me of the pain and the suffering that my godmother, who had rheumatoid arthritis, suffered with for so many years, passed away a couple of years ago now, and what relief she may have found if medicinal cannabis had been available to her. In meeting mothers, fathers, sons, daughters who are risking their livelihoods and freedom to secure safe, consistent tinctures to alleviate the pain or symptoms of their loved ones, I thought to myself, I would do the same. But part of the risk with medicinal cannabis has been sourcing reliable medicine. Tinctures can vary in quality and efficacy, with the added risk of dodgy dealers taking advantage of vulnerable individuals. Then there are the white knights who have worked tirelessly to produce and give quality tinctures to patients. Their courage and advocacy I commend. And because of their work, I can stand here today, hopefully, in the hope of a nationally consistent scheme bringing numerous benefits to both patients and the community. It is critical for those suffering, for those patients, to be able to talk freely and openly with their medicinal practitioners about the benefits of this treatment. It also gives doctors further options for treatment in cases where conventional medicines have failed to work. This is highly beneficial not only for patients currently using medicinal cannabis, but also for future patients, for people who may be having cancer chemotherapy, suffering HIV-related illness, multiple sclerosis, spinal cord injury, epilepsy, diabetes, Alzheimer's, inflammatory bowel disease. The list goes on and on and on to the benefits that medicinal cannabis can provide to those suffering disease and pain. So this bill, the Narcotics Drug Amendment Bill 2016, will bring additional benefits with the national licensing scheme creating two classes of licence, medicine and research. The creation of the research licence will enable further research and clinical trials, such as in New South Wales, which is co-sponsored by Victoria and Queensland. And clinical evidence will help solidify the significant anecdotal evidence which supports the benefits of medicinal cannabis. With the importation of plants and seeds into Australia, the opportunity to refine and understand the different strains and their properties will be provided. And our understanding of the benefits of medicinal cannabis for a variety of ailments will be furthered, and that is so important. But coupled with the national scheme for cultivation for medicinal purposes, we will be giving this industry the best chance of creating effective, consistent medication. So the legislation introduced will decriminalise the manufacturing of medicinal cannabis, but has also the potential to create an inconsistency with state and territory laws. And therefore state and territories each have differing criminal laws around the possession and the use of cannabis, and that is where they need to come to the party and change their laws. Currently, the use, possession, supply and trafficking of cannabis is prohibited in all states and territories prescribed by the State Crimes Acts and Codes and Poisons Acts in those various states. So it is clear that regardless of us passing this law today, that it is only the first step and still does not provide the treatment needed for those suffering pain in our communities. So I do urge the Minister, after this part of the puzzle is passed, to take that up to those states and territories to get them on board. I certainly will do so in my own home state. I think there has been, in the last year in this place, a higher level of leadership from a number of MPs and senators on medicinal cannabis, and that national leadership is needed. A patchwork of access arrangements cannot emerge across different states and territories. That is the whole point of having a federally legislated approach. We need a uniform system of laws, both medical as well as criminal, in relation to access to this drug. We also need a uniform clinical guidelines to be developed, guidance on what products are produced, and national leadership to deal with problems as they arise. Australia already has a vast experience in managing controlled substances, such as growing poppies for the purpose of producing opiate-based medicines. And we also have the benefit and example of experience from our own overseas partners, which I alluded to earlier. Growers' licences must be connected to the supply chain, meaning a grower will need to have an arrangement in place with a manufacturer in order to get a licence. Permits will be issued to control the amount of cannabis that is produced, and the system will ensure that the oversupply of cannabis does not occur. The objective, of course, is to ensure that we do not have stockpiles of cannabis being produced and then ending up in unlawful purposes. Similarly, a manufacturer must be able to demonstrate their connection to the supply chain, dispensing to that patient so that it's consistent with the Therapeutic Goods Act. We need the Commonwealth and the states and territories working together because they all have a role to play in ensuring each aspect of the manufacture, use and possession of medicinal cannabis is legal. Having said all of that, of course medicinal cannabis is not a silver bullet to all the ailments that people suffer, but it is definitely potentially a source to alleviate pain. I've listened to so many stories from so many family members that have shared the incredible turnaround that their loved ones have experienced from the simple application of a tincture of medicinal cannabis each day. It is time for Australia to follow suit of other nations and provide this alternative treatment legally to help alleviate the suffering of our loved ones. I would like, in closing, to acknowledge some of the support that has already taken place by other leaders in our community in other states and territories. One particular is from the former Premier in Tasmania, Lara Giddings, who has tirelessly been campaigning for medicinal cannabis at the Tasmanian level. She, like me, has seen the benefits that it has provided to so many suffering in pain. I don't want all of that advocacy and leadership that has been on display by so many in those states and territories, particularly Lara, to go in vain if we don't complete the puzzle that is needed to provide a federal legislated scheme. And that is why it is so important that this bill is passed, but that the state and territories then do their role. Finally, in the words of Lucy Haslam, every time somebody dies in pain, that is a travesty that should not be happening. We can do something about this. Lucy, we are here with you, trying so hard to do something about this and make medicinal cannabis available in Australia as soon as possible, so that so many people suffering no longer have to take this illegally, can have it provided to them by a practitioner, and it can be another source of medicine that's available in our community, because we already know the benefits that it provides and that we need it so much to be provided.
Minister.
Thank you, Deputy President. The Narcotic Drugs Amendment Bill provides a clear national licensing scheme allowing the locally controlled cultivation of cannabis for medicinal and scientific purposes. Importantly, this bill provides the critical missing piece for the Commonwealth to enable a sustainable supply of safe medicinal cannabis products to Australian patients in the future. It is recognised that, while there are existing mechanisms by which medicinal cannabis from overseas can be accessed under Australian law, the problem is that limited supplies and export barriers in other countries have made this difficult. Under this scheme, a patient with a valid prescription can possess and use a medicinal cannabis product manufactured from cannabis plants legally cultivated in Australia, where the supply is appropriately authorised under the Therapeutic Goods Act 1989 and relevant state and territory legislation. Further, the Health Department has proposed down-scheduling cannabis for therapeutic uses to Schedule 8 of the Poisons Schedule, which would also simplify arrangements around the legal possession of medicinal cannabis. The decision to treat any condition with a medicine is one that should be made in consultation with a medical professional who has weighed up the available medical and scientific evidence to determine if there is a likely benefit for their patient and whether that benefit outweighs the risks. The government's model puts the medical professional at the centre of clinical decision-making where they should be. This bill will allow medicinal cannabis products that are manufactured in Australia to be supplied for the purposes of clinical trials or to be prescribed for patients with particular conditions by medical practitioners authorised to do so by the Therapeutic Goods Administration. The bill also enables research, in particular clinical trials, to expand the evidence base so that more products could potentially be approved through the medicines registration processes under the Therapeutic Goods Act, provided they meet efficacy, safety and quality standards required for prescription medicines. As that evidence base expands, it is possible that more patients will be prescribed medicinal cannabis products if their doctor considers it appropriate. There are many advocates and everyday Australians who have played a tremendous and tireless role in bringing this important issue to the attention of the nation. I acknowledge my parliamentary colleagues from across the political spectrum who have come together in this place to work in a completely bipartisan fashion to ensure we are able to stand here on this historic day. I particularly want to acknowledge Senator Ian MacDonald for his tireless advocacy, and also Kevin Anderson, State Member for Tamworth, for his dedicated work on this issue. And I also want to acknowledge the work of those in the department who have been tireless in working to bring this bill to fruition. In summary, this bill, in conjunction with established mechanisms, provides a secure supply chain from farm to pharmacy that will give patients access to medicinal cannabis products. The bill is not about the legalisation or decriminalisation of cannabis for recreational use, nor is this a discussion about making cannabis products available over the counter or outside of a discussion with a qualified doctor or through an approved clinical trial. It is important we maintain the same high safety standards for cannabis-derived products that we apply to any other medicine. I know many Australians would be concerned if medicinal cannabis products were to be subject to lower safety standards than common prescription painkillers or cholesterol medications. It is important to note that the manufacture of medicinal cannabis products will be subject to quality manufacturing requirements under the Therapeutic Goods Act. This bill, to allow the cultivation of legal medicinal cannabis crops in Australia under strict controls, strikes the right balance between patient access, community protection and our international obligations. I know for many there have been so many frustrations along the way and even times when they felt progress was not being made. However, today's outcome is a demonstration of this Parliament's commitment to not only ensure we get access to a safe, legal and reliable supply of medicinal cannabis products for Australian patients, but also that we get it right. I thank senators for their contributions to the debate on this bill.
The question is that the bill be now read a second time. Those of that opinion say aye. Against say no. I think the ayes have it. Clerk.
A bill for an Act to amend the Narcotic Drugs Act 1967 and for related purposes.
I'm not aware of any amendments being circulated, so unless any senator requires a committee stage, I'll invite the minister to move the third reading. Minister.
I move that the bill now be read a third time.
The question is that the bill be now read a third time. Those of that opinion say aye. Against say no. I think the ayes have it. Clerk.
A bill for an Act to amend the Narcotic Drugs Act 1967 and for related purposes.